In 1927, in a remote, forgotten village, two brothers ruled with fear and silence. Their crooked wooden house became a place of no return. Over 130 men, women, and children stepped inside its doors, and not a single soul ever came back. What happened in that house still chills the blood nearly a century later. The winter of 1927 hung over the village of Olkovka like a coffin lid, heavy and suffocating. Snow smothered the crooked roofs, muffled the creak of old barns, and pressed against the windows of log houses where kerosene lamps flickered against the darkness. Life went on as it always had, men trudging to the forest for firewood, women kneading rye bread with hands red from cold, children clinging to their mothers' skirts but beneath the routines. Fear coiled, silent and ever-present. That fear had a name, though it was rarely spoken aloud. The Savalev brothers. Their house stood at the very edge of the settlement, a crooked structure hunched beneath leaning pines, its shutters always drawn. Even in daylight, it seemed darker than it should be, as if the sun itself avoided touching its walls. At night, a faint glow leaked through the curtains, accompanied by sounds that set teeth on edge. Scraping metal, muffled cries, or bursts of laughter that froze the marrow. Children refused to walk that road. Women hurried past it with their heads down, and even the bravest men avoided glancing toward its sagging roof. To meet the eyes of Gregory or Alexei Savalev, villagers said, was to feel your soul shudder. The brothers had been born in Olkovka, but no one considered them part of it. Their father, a violent drunk, had died before the revolution. His body found one spring in a ditch with his skull cracked open. Their mother wasted away soon after. Some claimed of grief, others whispered by the hands of her own sons. From then on, the two lived alone, tall men with heavy shoulders and heavier silences. They did not till their fields, did not raise cattle, and yet they never went hungry. Their coins were always old imperial, rubles, long out of use, sometimes even tarnished gold, and no one dared to ask where they came from. It began with a child, but 12 years old, had taken the cattle out one summer evening. The cows returned at dusk, their bells clanging dully, but the boy did not. Search parties scoured the fields, torches flickering against the trees, Phyllis's horse from shouting his name. No trace. Only a small cap, damp with dew, lay in the dirt near the Savalev fence. Mothers wept. Men cursed under their breath, but no one knocked on the brothers' door. To accuse them aloud was to sign your own death warrant, and so silence swallowed the boy as surely as the earth. Rumors sprouted like weeds. Some swore the brothers' house stood on cursed ground, that centuries-old blood had soaked into its foundations. Others whispered they had struck a bargain with something unholy, that their eyes were too dark, their shadows too long. Among the youth, foolish dares spread. Who would touch the gate after sunset? One boy tried. He returned alive, but with a blistered hand, swearing the iron latch had burned his skin, though no fire touched it. After that, none dared again. Then came Anfisa. She had walked home from a fair in the neighboring village, her scarf bright red against the twilight. She never arrived. Days later, her torn scarf was found snagged on a thorn bush near the brothers' yard. Her mother sat for weeks on the church steps, rocking and clutching that scarf, whispering prayers that faded into the cold air. The villagers crossed themselves more often after that, bolted their doors earlier, and nailed crude wooden crosses above their windows. But deep down they knew such things were useless. The village elder tried to act. One evening he gathered the people in front of the church, his breath smoking in the frosty air. "We cannot live like this," he told them, his voice trembling. "Our people vanish. We must act." Silence answered him. No man stepped forward. No woman spoke. Everyone's eyes slid toward the edge of the forest, where the house loomed in imagination. And the meeting broke apart in uneasy quiet. And so the brothers walked openly through. They entered the shop, taking bread, flour, kerosene, paying with their ancient coins. Conversations stilled, eyes lowered. Their presence weighed like stone. Only when they left did people breathe again. as though some invisible pressure lifted. The vanishings multiplied. A hunter who entered the forest never came back. A family of wanderers passed down the road by the brothers' gate and was never seen again. A young girl visiting her aunt in the next settlement vanished between 1 mile marker and the next. Always, the shadows of suspicion stretched toward that sagging house, yet no one dared to cross its threshold. It was no longer simply a house. It was a mouth, swallowing one life after another, and the village had become its larder. As the summer of 1927 faded into autumn, the weight of fear pressed heavier upon all. The fields turned gold. The forests rustled with dying leaves, but no harvest song rose from the villagers' throats. They worked with their eyes lowered, their steps quick, and their prayers whispered. The house of the Savali brothers had become not just a building but a presence, like a storm cloud that refused to move on. It seemed to grow larger in their minds, its crooked roof looming over every conversation, its shuttered windows staring even when no one looked at them. Nights grew longer, and with them came the sounds. At first it was only the faint clatter of metal, like chains striking stone. Then came muffled voices, as if conversations were happening underground. Sometimes there were screams, short, cut off abruptly, leaving silence that was worse than the cry itself. Dogs howled and cowered, tails tucked, their eyes wide with animal knowledge. Children woke screaming, telling their mothers they had seen shadows at the window, tall and thin. Watching, the mothers hushed them, rocking them back to sleep. But they too lay awake afterward, staring into the darkness with pounding hearts. The elder, old Simeon Ivanovich, tried once more to rally courage. In his own home, he gathered the men, pouring vodka into chipped clay cups. "It is a curse," he whispered, glancing toward the shuttered windows as if the brothers could hear even through the night. "If we do nothing, there will be none of us left by spring." But no one answered. The men shifted in their chairs, staring into their cups, unable to meet one another's eyes. They knew he was right. Yet to act was to invite the brothers' wrath, and no one wished to be the next name whispered in grief. The vodka was drunk in silence, and the gathering dissolved. Still, there were a few who resisted in secret, a handful of villagers. Those who could not bear the silence began keeping crude records, hidden beneath floorboards or scratched into the backs of icons. They marked each disappearance with a date and a name: Petrusha and Fisa, the wandering family, the hunter, the schoolteacher who had mocked the brothers and vanished days later. By autumn, the hidden lists already counted nearly a dozen. By winter, they would count more. The schoolteacher's fate struck a deeper blow than most. He had come from the city, full of ideas and pride, bringing books and promises of learning. When he laughed at the villagers' fear, calling it superstition, some had almost believed him. But then he vanished. His books were found scattered in the road, their pages torn and rain-soaked. But his body was never seen again. To the villagers, it was proof, even knowledge, even education. Ibn Tesidia's confidence could not stand against the brothers' shadow. Silence returned, heavier than before. Father Anton, the priest, tried once. He fasted for 3 days, prayed until his knees bled, and then, clutching a wooden cross, marched toward the brothers' gate. The villagers watched from a distance, holding their breath. He raised the cross and cried, "Begone, servants of the devil!" For a moment, silence. Then, from the shuttered house, a laugh drifted out. Not one voice, but two, echoing, mocking, rising until it sounded less like laughter and more like howling. The priest stumbled back, his face pale, and when he returned to the church, his hair had gone white. He never spoke of what he had seen, but from that day, he avoided the road by the brothers' property entirely. Winter came early. Snow covered the fields, and the nights grew endless. That season, 3 more people vanished. One was Mikhail, a drunken farmer who had boasted in the tavern that he would prove the brothers' house was nothing but wood and stone. He staggered out into the storm with a bottle in hand. In the morning, the bottle lay shattered by the doorstep of the Savaleev house, surrounded by footprints that led forward but never back. Mikhail was never seen again. That night, a light glowed brighter than usual in the upper window of the house, and villagers swore they saw two shadows moving against the curtain, swaying as though in celebration. From then on, the house earned its name again and again, the house without exit. Those who entered were never seen again. No baddies, no graves, only absence. And absence, multiplied, became terror. Families huddled together at night, clutching each other, praying for dawn. Fathers sat by doors with axes in their laps, though in their hearts they knew such weapons were useless. Mothers held their children close, whispering lullabies to drown out the distant sounds that drifted from the edge of the village. Children learned early never to say the brothers' names aloud after dark, for it was said that a single whisper could draw their gaze upon you, and once their gaze fell, no prayer could protect you. By the end of the year, more than 20 names had been added to the hidden records. Some said the number was higher 30, even 40 if one counted the travelers and strangers who never reached the next settlement. But no one dared to keep an exact count. The truth was too heavy to bear. The villages moved through their days like shadows, waiting for their turn, living under a silence that pressed heavier than any winter snow. The brothers walked amongst them still, their tall figures moving through the frost-covered streets. They spoke rarely, but their presence was enough. People stepped aside, lowering their eyes, pressing themselves against walls to make way. Interwak silence lingered, as though even sound feared to follow them. And so Olkovka lived, day after day, under the shadow of two men who were no longer quite men at all. The final weeks of 1927 pressed down upon Olkovka with a darkness that seemed endless. Snow blanketed the fields, muffling sound, and the nights stretched so long that dawn felt like a rumor rather than a promise. Fires burned low in stoves, but even the warmth of wood could not lift the chill that clung to the village. It was not the cold of winter alone. It was the cold of dread, the kind that seeped into bones and souls alike. By then, the Saviliv brothers had become more than men in the villagers' minds. They were legends, nightmares walking in flesh. The stories had grown with each disappearance. Some swore they had seen the brothers carrying sacks through the snow, heavy and dripping. Others whispered that the house itself had begun to grow, new rooms sprouting like tumors, each one hungrier than the last. And a few claimed that the cries heard on stormy nights were not the cries of the dying, but of something being born in the dark, a thing that should never have been allowed to live. Children no longer asked questions. They knew better. Their eyes carried fear older than their years, the kind passed from parent to child like a curse. Women rarely spoke at all, except to pray, their voices hoarse from whispers. And the men of Olkovka, once strong and proud, moved with the heaviness of cattle driven to slaughter, resigned to whatever fate awaited them. There were nights when the brothers' presence was felt even without sight. Footsteps crunching slowly outside a cottage, pausing, then moving on. A shadow stretching across a window, though no figure stood outside. The smell iron and rod drifting suddenly into a room and vanishing just as quick. Families would huddle together, eyes squeezed shut, breaths held, praying that the brothers would pass them by. Sometimes they did. Sometimes, come morning, one bed would be empty, and the silence in that house would be permanent. The hidden records grew longer. Names were scratched into scraps of paper, carved into wood, whispered into the ears of those who dared to remember. 20 names became 30. 30, perhaps, became more. No one could say for certain, because no one dared to keep the truth whole. Fear scattered it, broke it into fragments, but the weight of it pressed on everyone alike. Father Anton wasted away before the year ended. His hair had already turned white after his confrontation at the brothers' gate, but now his skin grew gray, his eyes hollow. He preached less and less, his sermons dissolving into mutters, until one day he simply did not appear in church at all. Some said he had locked himself in his room and refused to open the door. Others believed he had walked into the forest and kept walking until the snow covered him. Whatever the truth, Olkovka was left without its shepherd, and the silence grew heavier still. The house of the Savalivs, meanwhile, stood firm against the storms. Its shutters rattled, its roof groaned, but it did not fall. Smoke still rose from its crooked chimney, curling into the gray sky, carrying with it a stench that no wind could fully scatter. The villagers avoided even looking at it. To acknowledge it was to invite it into your thoughts, and from thoughts to dreams, and from dreams to fate. Best to keep your eyes on the ground, your prayers in your throat, and your hope buried deep where it could not be stolen. By the last night of December, Old Kofka was a village of ghosts. Families celebrated nothing. No carols rosé. No feasts were shared. They sat by their stoves in silence, clutching one another, waiting for dawn. But dawn, they knew, brought no safety. For as long as the house stood at the edge of the village, as long as the brothers lived within it, there would be no peace. Only the steady counting of disappearances, one after another, until none remained to count at all. And so the year closed, not with bells or laughter, but with silence. A silence heavier than the snow, thicker than the forest shadows, deeper than the grave. The silence of Alkovka, held in the grip of two men who were no longer men, and of a house that had earned its name 100 times over the house without exit. The house of the Savaliv brothers stood like a wound at the edge of Olkovka, an open sore that never healed. Its crooked walls leaned as though sagging under the weight of all the screams they had absorbed. Its chimney belched a smoke that smelled faintly of iron and rot, and its shuttered windows stared blankly into the forest like blind eyes that nevertheless saw too much. To outsiders, if any dared pass it, might have looked like an ordinary peasant's hut, shabby and unkempt. But to the people of Old Kovka, it was a mouth. Once entered, never exited. Stories about what lay inside grew with each year. Some claimed the house had more rooms than could possibly fit within its crooked frame, corridors that bent upon themselves, staircases that led to walls, doors that opened only to darkness. Others swore that the cellar stretched deep into the earth, carved not by human hands, but by something older, where the brothers chained their victims and dug pits for the bones. No one had seen it with their own eyes. Yet the details multiplied, passed in whispers by firelight, each retelling heavier with dread. What could be, confirmed at least by fragments came from those who had dared to close. Hunters who crept through the forest swore they saw cages through cracks in the shutters. One merchant who passed near the yard swore he heard moaning from beneath the ground. And once, a group of boys who followed a dare peeked through a gap in the fence and saw blood dripping from a sack Gregory carried across the yard, leaving a dark trail in the snow. They fled without a word, but one of them vanished the following week. The others kept silent for the rest of their lives. The merchant Ivan Petrovich was the first to test the legend openly. He was a broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache, used to wolves, bandits, and worse, along the trade roads. When warned by villagers not to camp near the brother's house, he laughed. "Fairy tales," he said, patting the pistol at his belt. "I have survived the revolution. I'll survive 2 peasants." That night, he pitched his camp outside their gate. In the morning, his horse remained, stamping nervously, eyes rolling. His cart still stood, goods untouched, but Ivan Petrovich was gone. The villagers left the cart where it was, untouched until the snow buried it. For to lay hands on anything that had lingered too close to the Savalivs was to invite misfortune. Some claimed his cries could be heard echoing through the forest on stormy nights long after. Inside, the brothers lived by a rhythm no one else could understand. Gregory was deliberate, almost ritualistic, rising at the same hour, lighting the same lamp, performing his tasks with precision. Alexei was chaos incarnate, pacing, muttering, sometimes bursting into shrill laughter that made even his brother pause. Between them they maintained a world sealed off from the outside, a labyrinth of rooms where time itself seemed to stop. Some said icons once hung on their walls had been painted over with black pitch. Others whispered of shelves filled with jars containing things no one dared describe. And the Silaralways said to groan at night as though the earth beneath strained under the weight of suffering. The house was not passive. It seemed alive. Its floorboards groaned, not with footsteps, but with hunger. Its shutters banged even when the air was still, and its air was colder than the winter outside. Villagers who dared walk past swore they felt the walls exhale, as if the building itself were breathing, waiting. Some claimed it grew larger, subtly shifting with the seasons, stretching itself to hold more victims. One winter night, Mikhail, a farmer known for his heavy drinking, boasted in the tavern that he would prove the house was nothing more than wood and stone. "Fear makes fools of you all," he declared, raising his bottle. Staggering into the snowstorm, he vanished through the brothers' gate. The next morning, his bottle lay shattered on the doorstep. Footprints marked the snow up to the door, but none led back. That evening, light glowed bright in the upper window, and villagers swore they saw two shadows swaying across the curtain, as if in celebration. The priest, Father Anton, had already tried to confront the darkness once. After 3 days of fasting, he had approached the gate, cross-raised, crying out, "Begone, servants of the devil!" But the house answered with laughter mocking, echoing too deep for human throats. He stumbled back white-haired, and from then on avoided the road altogether. His failure sealed the villagers' fate. If even the priest could not drive the brothers away, who could? By 1928, the phrase, "the house without exit," was spoken in whispers across the region. Travelers avoided Olkovka entirely, choosing longer routes through swamps and forests rather than risk the cursed road. Those few who strayed too close vanished, their absence added to the unspoken tally. No one reported it to authorities. To speak aloud was to give the brothers your name, and names had power. Better silence, always silence. Yet the silence itself was a prison. Families locked themselves indoors at night, huddled by stoves, listening to the distant sounds that drifted on the wind moans, the scrape of shovels on frozen ground, the screech of Alexei's violin twisting a tune into madness. Fathers kept axes at their sides, though they knew wood and iron could not stand against shadows. Mothers held children tight, praying their names would not be the next added to the hidden records, and children, wide-eyed, learned before they could read that to survive was to remain unseen, unheard, forgotten. The house loomed above them all, not merely wood and stone but something far older, a hunger made flesh, and as the years crawled forward, the villagers understood that as long as the Savalivs lived, no one would ever truly be free. By the spring of 1928, Olkovka was no longer a village of the living but a settlement of the waiting. Each dawn felt like borrowed time. Each night, a sentence yet to be carried out. The air itself seemed charged with dread. Even the crows circled more quietly above the thatched roofs, as if unwilling to disturb what lay beneath. Life continued. Bread was baked. Fields were sown. Water fetched from the well, but all of it was done in silence. A silence so heavy it pressed upon the lungs. The Savalive brothers did not need to rule with weapons. Their reign was one of absence, of names, erased from memory. Each time someone vanished, the others bowed their heads lower, spoke softer, lived smaller. Fear was their leash, and it bound tighter with every passing week. Children no longer ran free in the meadows. They clung to their mothers' skirts, eyes wide with knowledge too old for them. Men no longer sang drinking songs in the tavern. They sipped in silence, their eyes fixed on the floor. Women, once the backbone of the village's chatter, whispered only in kitchens, their voices trembling like candle flames. The brothers walked among them freely. Gregory with his heavy steps and unblinking stare. Alexei with his crooked grin and muttering lips. They bought bread with tarnished coins, took kerosene and salt, moved like wolves among sheep. No one challenged them. To speak against them was to vanish. Even to meet their eyes too long was to invite a nightmare that might never end. Still, resistance flickered in secret. A handful of villagers, unable to bear the weight of silence, kept hidden records. Old Simeon Ivanovich, the elder, scratched names into a piece of wood he kept beneath his bed. Petrusha and Fisa, the hunter, the teacher, Mikhail. That spring more than 30 names were carved there. A litany of the lost. A widow named Darya hid scraps of paper beneath her stove, each one bearing the date of another disappearance. A young man named Pavel scratched tally marks into the beams of his barn, one for each soul never seen again. These secret memorials gave no comfort, but they preserved the truth. If the village was to be swallowed whole, at least someone had counted the mouths that fed the darkness. Whispers spread of travelers in nearby regions who avoided Olkovka altogether. Merchants called it the Black Village, a place where men vanished and women wept. No official reports were filed, no soldiers sent, for who among the villagers dared to speak beyond the borders? Silence was safer than truth, and the brothers' shadows stretched farther than their fence. Children drew pictures in the dirt to tall figures with hollow eyes, a crooked house with a door but no windows. Mothers wiped the drawings away quickly, terrified that the mere image might call attention. Stories filtered into bedtime whispers. Do not walk the road at dusk. Do not answer if someone calls your name from the dark. Do not whistle after sundown lest the brothers hear. Folklore and survival blurred until fear itself became tradition. Some claimed the brothers demanded tribute, though no one could prove it. A cow gone missing, a sack of grain left by the roadside, a loaf of bread abandoned on a fence-post offerings, perhaps to appease the hunger. Whether they were taken by the brothers or by desperate villagers mattered little. The intent was the same, to buy another day of safety, another night of breath. The church stood hollow. Father Anton had vanished, whether into madness or the forest no one knew, and without him the bells fell silent. Dust gathered on icons, candles burned low, and the house of God felt abandoned. Some villagers still crossed themselves before sleeping, but their prayers were muttered with more doubt than faith. For how could heaven hear them when hell itself lived in their midst? In this vacuum of faith and courage, the Savaliv brothers grew bolder. They no longer bothered to keep their windows fully covered. Sometimes flickers of candlelight revealed silhouettes moving in ways that made the stomach churn. On certain nights, Alexei played his violin, a screeching tune that clawed at the nerves, rising and falling like the cries of something half-human. The sound carried across the village, through walls and roofs, threading its way into dreams. People woke sweating, convinced they had heard their own names whispered between the notes. It was in this season of fear that the first murmur of resistance stirred. Pavel, the young man who had lost his sister to the brother's shadow, began to speak in hushed tones to others who had kept secret records. "We cannot go on like this," he said. "If we wait, we will all vanish, one by one. Better to face them and die than to live like ghosts." His words spread quietly, testing the ears of those who still had courage. Some agreed, nodding with clenched jaws. Others shook their heads, insisting silence was survival. But the seed was planted, and seeds have a way of growing even in frozen ground. By mid, the tension in Olkovka was unbearable. Fields were neglected, livestock wandered thin, and the village seemed to rot from within. Fear had not only taken lives, it had taken the will to live. It was then that the records, hidden and separate, began to align. Semyon's carved wood, Darya's scraps of paper, Pavel's tally marks all told the same story. More than 40 had vanished since the first cap was found by the brothers' fence. 40 souls in less than 2 years. The realization spread like fire in dry grass. 40, a number too large to ignore, a number too damning to keep silent. For the first time, fear wavered. In its place came anger, fragile but sharp, and anger, once awakened, could not be buried again. The villagers began to gather in secret, not in the tavern or the elder's house, but in barns, cellars, and fields. They whispered of confronting the brothers, of burning the house, of calling authorities despite the risk. Each plan dissolved in terror, but each meeting made silence harder to maintain. They began to believe that if they did nothing, the village itself would vanish from the earth, its name forgotten, its houses swallowed by forest. Better to risk everything than to be erased. The house without exit still loomed, its chimney breathing smoke, its shutters rattling, its shadows stretching long across the snow. But for the first time since the terror began, the villagers looked not only with fear, but with something else. Defiance. The summer of 1928 bled into autumn, and with it came a silence, different from the one that had ruled Olkovka for so long. It was not the silence of fear alone, though fear still gripped every soul. It was the silence before a storm, the breath held in the chest, the pause before something breaks. For nearly 2 years, the Savaliv brothers had taken what they wished. Voices, the very will of the village end, No one had stopped them. But now the weight of 40 lost names pressed too heavily to bear. Even fear had limits, and the people of Volkovka had reached theirs. It was Pavel, the young man with the tally marks carved into his barn, who spoke the words aloud first. "If we do nothing, there will be no one left." His voice trembled, but the truth in it rang clear. Others nodded, some reluctantly, some with sudden fire. Darya, who had lost both husband and son, clenched her fists and whispered, "Better to burn with the house than to live in its shadow." Even old Semyon Ivanovich, weary and trembling, muttered that he would rather die with an axe in his hands than wait for the brothers to take him in his sleep. The decision was not made in one night, but in many. Whispers in barns, meetings by wells, prayers in half-collapsed churches. Each voice that agreed added a stone to the foundation of defiance. At last, the plan was formed. They would strike together, all at once, for only numbers could give them courage. They would come at dusk, when the brothers lit their lamps, and they would set the house alight. Fire was the only weapon they believed might end what iron and wood could not. When the chosen evening came, the village gathered in silence. Men carried axes, scythes, and torches. Women carried stones and prayers. Even children clung to their mothers' skirts, their eyes wide, for they knew history was being written in that moment. The air trembled with fear, but also with something sharpened into resolve. They approached the house as the sun bled into the horizon. Smoke already curled from the chimney, and a faint screech of violin drifted into the dusk. The villagers froze at the sound, hearts quailing, but Pavel stepped forward. He struck his torch against a rock, flame bursting to life, and raised it high. "For the lost," he said. His words cracked, but the fire did not falter. The first torch struck the walls, then another, then another. Flames licked at the dry wood, spreading hungrily. The house groaned, its shutters rattling violently as though alive. From within came the sound of Laughter Grigori's low and heavy, Alexei's shrill and broken. The villagers wavered, terror gnawing at their resolve. But the fire grew louder, a roar that drowned out the laughter. Then the door burst open. Gregory stood framed in the flames, tall and broad, his eyes black as pits. In his hand was an axe that gleamed red in the firelight. Behind him, Alexei writhed and grinned, his violin screeching even as smoke poured around him. For a moment the villagers faltered, some turning to run, but Pavel stepped forward, shouting, "Together," and hurled his torch at Gregory's feet. The brothers advanced, but numbers pressed against them. Stones flew, axes swung, torches stabbed. Gregory struck down one man, then another, his blows heavy as thunder. But the crowd surged, driven by years of grief. Alexei screamed with laughter, his bow slicing the violin until strings snapped. And then he lunged, with the jagged wood like a blade. A woman struck him across the skull with a stone, and he stumbled, grinning still as blood poured down his face. The fire consumed the house, flames racing along its beams, devouring its secrets. Smoke poured into the night, carrying with it the stench of rotten iron, the weight of 100 unseen graves. The brothers fought like beasts, but even beasts tire. Gregory fell first, struck from behind by an axe, his body crashing into the flames. Alexei staggered after him, his laughter finally breaking into a scream as the fire swallowed him whole. The villagers stood back, panting, weeping, clutching their wounds. The house roared like a dying monster, beams collapsing inward, sparks flying into the sky. No one moved to stop it. No one dared. They watched until nothing remained but blackened ruin and smoke curling into the stars when Dong Kameokovka was quiet. The brothers were gone, their house reduced to ash. The fields lay still, the forest silent. For the first time in years, the air felt lighter, as though a great weight had lifted. And yet, the silence that followed was not peace. It was emptiness. Too many names were missing. Too many chairs, forever empty. Freedom had come, but it had cost the village its soul. The hidden records were gathered at last. Semyon's carved wood, Darya's scraps of paper. Pavel's tally marks. They were brought together and counted. The number chilled them more than any winter wind. More than 130 names. 130 lives. Lost to the house. Without exit. The ashes cooled. The ruins blackened, but the memory burned hotter than the flames. Mother still wept at night. Children still woke screaming from dreams. And men stared into the fields with hollow eyes. The Savalaev brothers were gone, but the scar they left would never heal. 4 years afterward, travelers avoided Okovka. They said the soil was cursed, that the smoke of the burned house still clung to the trees, that whispers rose from the ruins on stormy nights. Some claimed to hear laughter in the wind, others the faint cry of a violin. The villagers never rebuilt on that ground. They let it lie fallow, a grave unmarked but undeniable. And so Okovka lived on smaller, broken but alive. They had taken back their lives, but they could never reclaim what was lost. For in the shadow of 2 brothers, they had learned a terrible truth. Evil does not always wear crowns or march with armies. Sometimes it lives in a crooked house, at the edge of a forest, wearing the faces of men, feeding on silence. And sometimes, even when it is burned to ash, its laughter lingers in the dark.